City and County Council. We acknowledge three very special centenaries this evening. Firstly, the Curfew Murders of Mayors George Clancy, Michael O'Callaghan and Joseph O'Donoghue, all three of whom were murdered on this very exact date 100 years ago. Secondly, Limerick's All-Ireland Senior Hurling win of 1921, a centenary ago, even though the final was played in 1923, but the record sets it out as 1921 champions. And thirdly, the fact that the Lee McCarthy Cup was presented as the trophy for the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Championship for the first time in 1921 to our captain, the Limerick captain, Bob McConkey. Our discussion panel are very renowned and eminent, but before we progress to the discussion, to open proceedings, we commence with a welcome from the Cathaoirleach of Limerick GAA, John Cregan.
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of Limerick GAA County Board, it is indeed my great privilege to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this evening's event being brought to you by Limerick GAA in association with Limerick City and County Council. Early last year, Limerick GAA took a decision to respectfully mark a number of events that took place in the early 1920s. Earlier this year, we remembered the late Tom Hogan, a fellow county man who was shot in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday and lost his fight for life a few days later from the wounds he received. We honoured Tom with a wreath-laying ceremony at his grave in Drummond Cemetery. It is with a great sense of pride and delight that tonight we continue in the same vein as we commemorate the murders of the then sitting Mayor of Limerick, George Clancy, and his immediate predecessor in that role, Michael O'Callaghan. We also remember tonight Joseph O'Donoghue, who also lost his life during the events that became known as the Curfew Murders. All of the above named were prominent members of our great association, that is the GAA, and richly deserve our appreciation and remembrance. My fellow County Board Officer, Paul Foley, who has a very deep interest in such historic events, was tasked on behalf of the board with organising an actual event at the Strand Hotel to suitably mark the occasion. But unfortunately, the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic to our shores put pay to that, and then Paul quickly turned his attention to organising a virtual event. I want to thank you, Paul, for your professionalism, your dedication and your attention to detail, which I have no doubt will ensure that tonight's production will be a fitting tribute to those we are remembering. Our moderator this evening needs little introduction. Mark Foley, one of our own, is in his own right a famous son of Limerick, known far and wide, both at home and abroad, for his classy and passionate exploits on the hurling fields of Munster and beyond. A former twice-honoured All-Star hurler and former senior hurling captain, a mentor by profession and a teacher of history, Mark is ideally placed to moderate tonight's discussion, and we thank you, Mark, for giving of your time so generously. How fitting and poignant that we are being joined this evening by the current Mayor of Limerick, Councillor Michael Collins, representing the citizens of our city and county. And I know the relevance of serving as Mayor 100 years on from the infamous Curfew Murders has meant much soul-searching and meaningful reflection for the present incumbent of that high office. Thank you, Mayor Collins, for taking the time to be with us this evening and for your support and that of your council for this venture. I would also like to very much welcome our esteemed panellists to this evening's event. Professor Gearóid Ó Tuathaig is both nationally and internationally respected as a historian and academic. But in the context of tonight, it is also noteworthy that his brother-in-law, Tony Bramall, served as Mayor of Limerick in 1982 and 1983. Sharon Slater is the author of numerous publications, and through the medium of her Limerick's Life platforms, she specialises in and promotes the history of Limerick. Tom Toomey, a former South Liberties GAA player, is the author of many historical publications. His book, The War of Independence in Limerick, 1912 to 1921, was recognised as a balanced historical narrative and was widely acclaimed. You are all most welcome, and thank you for your time. When my colleagues and I in Limerick GA looked back 100 years to 1921, another, and indeed very much separate, historic event sprang to mind, and that was, of course, the fact that Limerick were crowned All-Ireland Senior Hurling Champions for that year, with the final played in 1923. And the late and great Bob McConkie, the then Limerick captain, became the first recipient of the Lee McCarthy Cup. And now, 100 years on, how fitting that the present Limerick Senior Hurling team are the current All-Ireland Senior Hurling Champions, and that famed and much revered trophy is once again residing by Shannonside in the safe hands of our current captain, Declan Hannon, who has followed those same footsteps as Bob McConkie for the second time in 3 years, thus continuing our proud tradition. To this end, as we conclude tonight's event, our County Secretary, Mike O'Riordan, will on behalf of Limerick County Board officially unveil a replica of the jersey worn by Bob McConkie and his teammates 100 years ago. Can I thank Mike for his painstaking work in ensuring that this replica jersey, by its design, carefully and tastefully depicts the jersey worn by the Limerick senior hurlers of the early 1920s. In conclusion, can I say that I am convinced that at the end of the evening, all those who join us will have heard some enthralling accounts of what occurred back in 1921. And I'm quite sure that all will develop a clearer understanding of what the people of our city and county endured, politically, economically, and socially, during that most troubled period of our history. Finally, on a lighter note, can I say that the success of virtual events are at the mercy of technology. And to that end, I would ask for your patience in this regard. And here's hoping that the above mentioned technology will behave, as we wish the best of luck to our production team, led this evening by Raphael Rocco. Goraf Mila Mahaviv.
Mila Vuikas O'Cree a Hioin. Thank you very, very much, John, for your welcome. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the moderator and the MC for the evening, one of Limerick's finest ever hurlers and former senior hurling captain, Mark Foley. Mark Foley.
I suppose to begin with, it's more in privilege, Dom Seve and Sean Noch the mask and the sign all on their mask. I'm just delighted to be here amongst a panel of experts tonight. And I suppose, as the lad said, we're celebrating not only Limerick winning the All-Ireland, but commemorating as well the murdered Mayor George Clancy, his predecessor Michael O'Callaghan, and also James O'Donoghue on the 6th and 7th of March 100 years ago. I'd like to introduce you to begin with to our current Mayor of Limerick City and County Council, Michael Collins, to have a few words.
Or míle mágat a bharc. Bhfuil tufa a gcuine úsle. Tom Hora bheith sásta a bheith éanacht livenocht le haig an seminar speisialta. Elected representatives, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly delighted and very honoured to officially welcome you to this evening's online history seminar organised by Limerick GAA and in partnership with Limerick City and County Council. In both 1921 and 2020, Limerick were the All-Ireland Senior Hurling Champions, and it can be truly said that the two captains, Bob McConkie and Declan Hannon, are connected by unbreakable green and white bonds that have reached across the century. Here's hoping for another win in 2021. In the intervening 99 years, the GAA has been central to Limerick's local pride and sense of well-being. However, tonight is about the fateful night of the 7th of March 1921, when Limerick took centre stage in the War of Independence. On that fateful night, the sitting Mayor of Limerick, George Clancy, his immediate predecessor, Councillor Michael O'Callaghan, nationalists, Gaeilgeoirs and members of the GAA were murdered by British Auxiliaries. Also, volunteer and Westmeath native who had been living in Janesborough here in Limerick, Joseph O'Donoghue, was also murdered. As Mayor of Limerick, and 100 years on, I remember my own grandfather, Michael Collins, a member of the West Limerick IRA Brigade who was living in Limerick at that time. He was employed at the Royal George Hotel and worked undercover for the IRA locally. I'm sure he was well acquainted with George Clancy, Michael O'Callaghan, and Joseph O'Donoghue. The murders of the three men shocked public opinion at home and abroad and played a major role in undermining British rule in Ireland. So tonight, as I sit here in the Mayor's office in City Hall, I look across at Clancy Strand, across the majestic Shannon, named after Mayor Clancy, and his home at Castleview Gardens, where he was brutally murdered in front of his wife, and downriver to O'Callaghan Strand, named after Michael O'Callaghan, as he was killed a short time later in his home. And after, of course, volunteer Joseph O'Donoghue, who had been murdered earlier in Janesborough. I remember them men with reverence and respect, as their lives were sacrificed for Irish freedom. Tonight, these remarkable events will be discussed by four distinguished historians, who between them bring a wealth of experience and expertise to this topic. Professor Gearóid Tuig, former Vice President and Professor Emeritus in History at NUI Galway and former member of the Council of State. Dr. Brian Murphy, OSB of Glenstall Abbey. Sharon Slater, MA and Curator of Limerick's Life. And of course, Thomas Toomey, whom I know well, author of The War of Independence in Limerick, 1912 to 1921. Our discussion tonight will be chaired by our own Limerick great, Mark Foley, history teacher and great Gael and former Limerick senior hurling captain. I hope you enjoyed this informative and interesting evening of history. Go raibh míle maith agaibh go léir.
Thank you very much. So to begin with, I suppose really we'll start with Gearóid, and I suppose Gearóid needs no introduction really. One of the great historians of his generation, as Michael said, Professor Emeritus in History and Dean of Arts, or former Dean of Arts and Vice President of NUI Galway. Again, he was appointed to the Council of State by the President, Michael D. Higgins, in 2012, and has published extensively on modern Irish history, including as editor, the GA and Revolution in Ireland from 1913 to 1923. Well, tá fáilte wrote a Gearóid. Constá cuasaí.
Ní léon chailear an marc agus is privilédum bheith páirteach sa seminar seo agus mar limníoch tá man bhródúil ar fad gur tugu cuireadum. I suppose, Mark, what I would like to do is to say something about the circumstances, the situation of the place in which this foul deed took place a century ago. The murders were part of the final and perhaps the most ruthless phase of the Anglo-Irish War, or the War of Independence. But these particular murders took place, of course, in a very particular place, in a particular city. And it may well be that we should at least get the context of that first of all, and get it fairly clear. I suppose many people will think of Limerick as it is now, but of course, in 1921, population of Limerick county and city together was about 140,000, of which 39,000 was the population of the city. Population of the county as a whole had been dropping slightly over the previous 30 years, though not dramatically. Population of the city was fairly stable. The extent of the city was expanding because the suburbs were expanding. The old core of the city was congested, but the suburbs were expanding. The villas on both sides of the river, which had been a feature of the late 19th century, the villas were large detached houses in their own grounds. They, by the early 20th century, were joined by essentially rows of terraced, generally red brick housing that was for the prosperous middle class, as the suburbs extended out, as it were, from O'Connell Avenue on the south side and out the Ennis Road across the bridge. So Limerick is expanding physically. Now, that's not to say rather that it's expanding in every sense. If one were to think of the key words that would encapsulate or sum up the atmosphere, public opinion, the public spirit in Limerick in the spring of 1921, the three that I would suggest most appropriate are disruption, dislocation, and anxiety. Now, they weren't exclusively due to the guerrilla war, to the disruption and the military conflict that was taking place, though that affected every aspect of life. But there were other reasons also, profound reasons for dislocation and anxiety in the spring of 1921 in Limerick. It was a bustling city, a major centre for distribution, wholesale and distribution, a manufacturing city. A busy port, though many of the critics said that the port should have been busier if they were more efficient and if there was more works done. A railway terminus, very good links with other centres. Its economy, it has to be said, was a vibrant economy in many, many respects. The ones that were the traditional staples of the city were based very heavily on the agricultural hinterland, the rich agricultural hinterland. It had to do with bacon and pig meat and its processing. It had to do with flour milling. It had to do with the tanneries and leather. It had to do with footwear. It had to do certainly with the major success story across on the Lansdowne side, the condensed milk factory of Cleves in particular, which had been doing great business during the war. But there were also loads of local manufacturers with more local markets, some of which lasted up to our own time, which had regional markets in Munster. One thinks, for example, of Geary's biscuits and confectionery and sweets and that kind of thing. The housing of the city generally and the core of the city was a story of contrasts. The suburbs may have been expanding for the middle class, but the housing stock of the old city showed the inequality really of the city. On the eve of the Great War, perhaps about a fifth of the housing of the city was classified as tenements. And even in the later 1920s, probably a third of the city comprised lanes and courts and bows where sanitation was non-existent virtually and where there was no running water. So the poverty was clear in the old heart of the city, and it was from the old heartlands of the city that most of the working, both manual and non-manual labor, went to get to their work. The social worlds, I think the social worlds are what we would call the associational culture, extraordinarily vibrant in every respect. The river itself, remember the river was a major leisure resort, and this is the river before Ardnacrusha, before the dam. So you had fishing, you had swimming, you had rowing, and the river was a central artery of socialization and of leisure. The clubs and societies, and more particularly the clubs that involved rules and games and sport and competition, they had been developing really from the final third of the 19th century, were very well developed across all of the codes in the city in particular, and also indeed into every part of the county. And it has to be said that the GAA in particular was pivotal in much of this. It had its roots in Limerick, of course, from its very inception. The hurling clubs with familiar names in the city, they tended, some of them, to rise for a time and then to fall, to go from senior to junior ranks, to drop out for a few years. But the names and, if you like, the rivalries that became familiar in later decades were already there. South Liberties, Clahon, St. Patrick's, Young Ireland, Shamrocks, Star, a new foundation just before 1920. And of course, on the north side of the river, there was Treaty, originally Treaty Stone, and later for many decades, Treaty Sarsfields. And you had familiar names on what were then the country, so to speak, but they were the outskirts. They ringed the city on its periphery. We're talking about names of famous hurling clubs: Castleconnell, Kilmurray, Mungret, Croom, Kappa. And for tournaments, and tournaments were a great thing, Partine and the Clare side was dragged in usually to give a bit of timber, as it were, to some of the contests in the city. Cinemas were beginning to shift from the old silence to the sound movies. And Limerick was on the cusp of what would be a major expansion in cinemas and indoor entertainment. In 1922, the Grand Central opened. The same year, or 2 years later, I think it was, the Lyric opened, and there was music everywhere in the city. Choirs and music is renowned for it. An interesting thing about hurling, how widespread hurling was. If you look at the RIC reports, and Tom Tooney will be familiar with these, the RIC reports, and indeed even some of the complaints of the IRA volunteers, a regular complaint was street hurling, young fellas hurling on the street. That that puzzled, or it could puzzle people as to why they would be against that. It wasn't because of hurling per se. It was because the most common mode of transport and distribution was the horse and car. And of course, horses would be spooked easily. So effectively, you had young fellas being warned not to be hurling on the street in case they would spook the horses, as it were, who were delivering loads of coal or whatever the case may be. There were plenty of other reasons, I suppose, why Limerick was renowned for its socialization, for being a place of gatherings. The most important one of all, and the most common one, for both sexes, of course, for both genders, was religion, religious practice. It was an extraordinarily devotional city. 95% of the population were Roman Catholic, but more than that, sodalities, confraternities, novenas, the general rituals which brought people together. Limerick was a byword for it. It is, I think, important, I won't go on too long on this, just to mention for what contemporaries would have felt as the characteristic sounds and smells of the city. They would have had horses' hooves and carts. They would have heard particularly what were known in later decades as hobnail boots, the strong boots with reinforced soles of men and indeed of women. Those heading off early in the morning and coming home very often late in the afternoon at night, men and women traveling across the city in large numbers to work and to worship. Hobnail boots, the smell of horses, and the truckle of carts. I mentioned disruption and anxiety. The economy was in a trouble, and that was one of the major sources. The war had been a boom period for agricultural prices. But from the autumn of 1920, agricultural prices began a sharp decline. There was fierce pressure, farmers' incomes dropped, there was unemployment, and on top of that, the post-war demobilization of soldiers meant that there were large numbers chasing a diminishing number of jobs, particularly in the casual labor market. Perhaps in or about 2,000 ex-servicemen in Limerick by 1921, effectively unemployed. The other problem was, of course, that the war itself, the actual military campaign, itself was hugely disruptive of the economy. Crown forces took reprisals against creameries, for example. People were afraid going to work. And if you look at the situation, Limerick's fatalities during the war, the general war from 1917, let us say, until end of 1921, Limerick had about 131 fatalities. But half of those came in 1921 alone. Half of those fatalities. And indeed, even in the months leading up to the murder of the mayors in O'Donoghue, even in the months leading up to that, there were heavy fatalities. I reckon that we're probably looking at least 17. And these fatalities were to do with military action for the most part. Limerick itself was an extremely important centre. And of course, just a short time before the mayors were murdered, one of the most successful IRA ambushes of the whole War of Independence had taken place out the road in Drumkeen in February. And on top of that, the night before the Auxiliaries murdered the three mayors, the RIC sergeant in Kilmallock, who had an enviable reputation, certainly as a man for pointing out IRA men and so on, he had been killed. So the retribution and the reprisals were pretty severe. And of course, Limerick was a strongly Sinn Féin city. And so was the county even more so. And I'll finish maybe on one or two things to say what the political atmosphere was. In the local government elections of 1920, they came in two stages. In January, for the urban and urban district areas. Limerick City, 26 of the 40 elected were Sinn Féin, 5 Labour and 9 Independents. In midsummer, when the county council elections were held, Sinn Féin swept the boards on Limerick County Council. So that it was a strongly Sinn Féin city. It was a strongly Republican city. Mayor Callaghan was elected, the first to be elected under that new corporation, and of course, George Clancy was his successor. I mentioned disruption, and perhaps one of the areas that was heavily disrupted was the GAA. Reference has been made to the fact that the All-Ireland generally wasn't played until 23. But more than that, within the county, there was a great deal of disruption. And some of that disruption was of a very distressing kind. For example, I'll give one notorious example. Tom Toomey is familiar with it and others as well. The example of Jim Dalton. and a well-known all-round sportsman. Very prominent in the life of the city, very prominent in all aspects of activism, as it were, trade union activism, Sinn Féin activism, and so on. He was captain of the battalion. But there were suggestions that he had been seen in the company, with detectives or with members of the police. To make a long story short, he was ambushed and shot. There wasn't a court-martial or a trial of any kind. He was ambushed and shot by another unit of the volunteers. A hugely controversial incident. It indicated the disruption. It indicated the suspicions. It indicated rivalries, personal and between different groups, that were a feature of other counties as well. But it also indicated what I mentioned earlier, anxiety which shaded into paranoia. The fact is that the feeling that information was being given fed rumors very quickly. And once suspicion rested upon people, it was very difficult. Now, as it transpired, later inquiries, official inquiries, and indeed many at the time, exonerated Dalton, though he was accused of being indiscreet. But Dalton was the kind of figure who was, I suppose you would say, was a casualty of the anxieties and disruption caused by the war to what would otherwise have been a career of community activism. So to sum up, Limerick in the spring of 1921 was a city and a community, and the same is true of the county because of the sweeps of auxiliaries and the sweeps of police in particular, beset with dislocation and uncertainty, falling prices, unemployment, an uncertain landscape regarding what the economy held in the agricultural heartland of the Golden Vale. A military struggle that was going backwards and forward, but was at its perhaps most severe and most ruthless on both sides in the spring of 1921. Now, within a short few months, there would be a truce. Before the end of the year, there would be the treaty followed by the Civil War. And of course, on the employment front, within 3 years, the greatest and largest engineering scheme in Europe at the time would start out the road in Ardnacrusha. And effectively the Shannon scheme would transform the economy and the landscape of the city. But on the evening of the 7th of March of 1921, when those two mayors, George Clancy, the sitting mayor, his predecessor, Michael Callahan, and the poor officer, IRA man O'Donoghue and James early in the day, on the evening that they were killed, that future didn't seem clear at all to the citizens, who woke shocked and sickened by the atrocity that had been committed in the city. Okay, Fágan mi dún sinné.
Thanks very much for that. I suppose backdrop to what life was like in Limerick at the time, both socially, economically and culturally. And it's also nice as well to have a little bit about the GA. And I suppose Limerick GA has had peaks and troughs since the foundation of the GA, and there's been many political elements involved in the success and maybe the not so prosperous nature of Limerick GA. We might look at that a little bit later, but thanks very much for that, Gearóid. It gives a fantastic backdrop to the events that were about to unfold 100 years ago. I'd now like to introduce you to Tom Toomey. Tom has been involved in local history for many, many years. He's published a number of works, including his landmark, I suppose, publication, The War of Independence in Limerick from 1912 to 21, which is a really fantastic work detailing all armed encounters in the county from January 1919 to the truce in 1921. He's lectured, extensively on local history and has written a number of other booklets as well, and including Forgotten Dreams, the biography of Major Jed O'Dwyer. So we'd like to welcome Tom. I suppose Tom is going to go through, I suppose, the background again to the events of 100 years ago, introduce us to the three people concerned, James O'Donoghue, Michael O'Callaghan, and George Clancy, and just to go through what actually happened on the night in question. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Mark. The three people involved, Joseph O'Donoghue was trained as a victualler or a butcher. He was from Balnacargy in County Westmeath, and he came to Limerick to manage the River Place Meat Company. Now, a peculiar thing about County Westmeath is it had a tradition of emigration or migration to the Argentine. A lot of people from Westmeath went to Argentina. So when the River Plate Meat Company were looking for a manager for their shop in Limerick, hey presto, they landed with Joseph O'Donoghue. Now, it was believed by British intelligence that Joseph O'Donoghue was using his cover for importing meat as a cover for importing arms and ammunition. Certainly British intelligence believed that, and I'd say it wasn't without some credibility. I'd say that he was involved because he was heavily involved in the volunteers, and they had been searching around Westmeath for some time before they eventually launched on him in Limerick. The second man killed that night, George Clancy, was from Grange. George Clancy was from a family that had a long tradition. His father or his grandfather had been Fenians, and they had taken part in the attack in Kilmallock Barracks in 1867. George Clancy, as such, was a very bright man, and he got a scholarship. He went to college or to university in Dublin, and he eventually qualified as a secondary teacher, and he taught for a while in Clongowes Wood, where he was a friend to our friend, oh Jesus. Anyhow, he gave up the teaching when his health failed, and he came back to Limerick and got a job as an insurance inspector. He was very involved in Conor na Gaeilge and the Gaelic League, and his wife was also involved. Like, there's a very good photograph of them on Limerick's Fighting Story of both George Clancy and his wife. Now, I think she was Killeen, Mary Killeen.
Mary Killeen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a very good photograph of them in dance, Irish dance regalia. The third man, Michael O'Callaghan, was, dare I say it, from a fairly wealthy background. His family owned the city tannery, and I think he may have been educated. Now, I could be wrong on this, but I think he was educated in Clongowes Wood. But either way, he was an only son, and as I say, his family were pretty wealthy. Now, his mother was one of the Smithicks. His mother was Smithick. I believe it's the same family that owns Smithick's Brewery in Kilkenny, or some relation of theirs. He married a lady called Kate Murphy. Now, Kate Murphy was educated, qualified in Cambridge. Very unusual for an Irish lady at the time, but she came from a family of very talented, at least 3 or 4 very talented females. They were highly qualified. They were teachers, secondary teachers, primary teachers. They ended up in Mary Immaculate College, dare I say it, teaching teachers. Another sister was a doctor. As I said, that's the background to the three men involved that night. Now, on the night, the first incident happened at Janesborough Avenue. An out knocking came to the door of to the door where Clancy was, or where Dunno was staying at Liddy's. And when Mrs. Liddy went to the door, there were 2 men outside, demanded admission that they were policemen. And there were a number of others outside, but she didn't see them, but she was aware that they were there. But 2 men came in, and it very soon transpired that they were interested in one person and one person only, and that was Joseph O'Donoghue. O'Donoghue was taken outside the door where the other members of the patrol were waiting, and the 2 leaders went up to his room and searched his room, but they found nothing. So they came down and they warned Mrs. Liddy that she wasn't to leave the house until 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, at the time, there was a curfew, So curfew ran from I think 7 o'clock in the evening until 6 o'clock in the morning, and Mrs. Liddy was warned not to leave the house. O'Donoghue was taken some distance down the road, and he was shot. Now, he was shot quite a number of times. One of the bullets he received was down to the top of the head, which would seem to have indicated that he was in a kneeling position when he was shot. That was at 11 o'clock, sometime between 11 and half 11, Joseph O'Donoghue was killed. At 1 o'clock, the house of Michael O'Callaghan, and about the same time, the house of George Clancy were visited by gunmen. In the case of O'Callaghan, 2 men called to the house. Now, they knocked and demanded admission. And Mrs. O'Callaghan recognized the voice of the man demanding admission. He had raided her house on a number of occasions, and he knew the setup. So, as I say, when she heard him shouting or looking to be admitted, herself and Michael O'Callaghan went downstairs to open the door. When they opened the door, they were confronted by 2 men heavily disguised with hats, collars pulled up, and goggles, wearing motorcycle goggles. For a moment, they didn't realize what was up. They asked O'Callaghan to step outside, and O'Callaghan realized then the danger he was in. So he backed up, and he refused to go out. But one of the men jumped forward and fired a number of shots into him. Mrs. O'Callaghan assaulted the 2 men, and she pulled the goggles off one of the men. But no matter what she did, they managed to escape from the house, leaving her, dare I say it, with her dying husband. Meantime, at Clancy Strand over in Castleview Gardens, something similar had happened. Now, for the 3 men who went to Clancy's, they had to pass the Strand Barracks. There was a sentry on duty, Private Lewis, on duty at the Strand Barracks. There was an officer in charge of the guard that night, Lieutenant Smith. Now, the 3 men was involved. They marched past the Strand Barracks without being checked or called to account. They went to Clancy's, and something similar happened at Clancy's as had happened at O'Callaghan's. The demanded admission, and in this case, there were 3 men. Now, Mrs. O'Callaghan, or Mrs. Clancy and George Clancy, again, like O'Callaghan's, they had been desensitized by previous raids. Their houses had been raided numbers of times. So you would say, like, why did they not react? They didn't react because, as I say, their houses had been raided, I think 3, 4, 5 times. So they just took it as another raid. And it was only when the door was opened and that the 3 men at Clancy's demanded that George step outside, it was then that they became aware of the threat that was there. He refused to step outside, but one of the officers, or one of the agents, jumped forward and fired 3 or 4 shots at him. Mrs. O'Callaghan, or Mrs. Clancy, like Mrs. O'Callaghan, went to the rescue of her husband. But again, the 3 men were too strong for her, and she was forced to relent, and they escaped. Now, think about it. They had fired a number of shots at Clancy's. They ran back past the sentry at the Strand Barracks. And as I say, by this time, Mrs. O'Callaghan had managed to contact Dr. Roberts in Mallow Street. And Dr. Roberts, taking his life in his hands, agreed to come to O'Callaghan's to give whatever aid he could to George or to Michael O'Callaghan. On his way down Sarsfield Street, he passed 5 men coming towards him on the opposite side of the street. Now remember, 2 men took part in the shooting at O'Callaghan's, 3 men took part in the shooting at Clancy's. And Dr. Roberts passes 5 men coming up Sarsfield Street. Dr. Roberts went to O'Callaghan's and gave what aid he could, but at that stage, Michael O'Callaghan was well beyond aid. So he gave him whatever aid he could. He also attended to Mrs. O'Callaghan because she had badly shot. And he went back. He promised that he'd went to the Franciscans on the way back to get Father, to get priest to come to O'Callaghan's to give aid. When he arrived at the Franciscans, he discovered that the police were there. Now, at that stage, Mrs. O'Callaghan had rung William Street Barracks. Now, by the admission of the inspector on duty that night, Inspector Ibbotson, he received a call from Mrs. O'Callaghan at 1:20 Yet it was 1:45 before he took his patrol out of the barracks. And as I say, when Dr. Roberts had walked from Mallow Street down to Clancy Strand, or down to O'Callaghan Strand, and was on the way back when he met the patrol at the Franciscans. Now, he went on his way home. The patrol under Ibbotson went out to O'Callaghan's. And on his way out, he passed a comment to the priest, Father, I can't remember his name, but that he mentioned murders. Now, there was no, at that stage, he should have had no inkling that there were other killings that night. And the priest took him up on it. And he backed off. He just murmured, maybe there will be murders. But he went to O'Callaghan's. And when he was finished at O'Callaghan's, he went from there to Clancy's. Now, what was taking him to Clancy's if he wasn't party to something that was going down? The man that was over the sentries in the Strand Barracks, Lieutenant Smith, right? When he was told that shots had been fired by the sentry, Private Lewis, instead of going towards where the shots were fired at Clancy's, he went off in the opposite direction and ended up above at O'Callaghan's. Anyhow, either way, it was very obvious that there was collusion between the officers that night, the inspector in William Street, the lieutenant over the guard at Clancy Strand. They seem to be, or at the Strand Barracks, they seem to be aware of what was going down. Now, the upshot anyway was when the city woke on Monday morning, not alone was the mayor had been killed, the ex-mayor had been killed, and a relatively innocent man who wouldn't be well known was also killed. On the Tuesday evening, the 3 bodies were brought to St. John's Cathedral and placed in front of the high altar. Wednesday was a day of official mourning, where the citizens of Limerick and district came and filed past the coffins in St. John's Cathedral. On Thursday, the funerals took place to Mount St. Lawrence. Massive crowds were involved. There was some very good photographs. I think you flashed up one there at the start, which showed the 3 coffins on the ground. There is also another very iconic photograph of the 3 coffins going up Mulgrave Street, and there's a guard of men on the walls, standing on the walls of Mount St. Lawrence, watching what was happening. As I said, the interments took place on the Thursday. In the meantime, a military court of inquiry was held. Now, neither Mrs. Clancy or Mrs. O'Callaghan were dignified with their presence, because they knew very well that their husbands had been murdered by the Crown forces. In the case of Mrs. O'Callaghan, she recognised the voice of the man that called out to them. It was that of George Montague Nathan, who had raided their houses 3 or 4 times in the previous month. So they were very clear about who was involved. Now, there was a second officer with Nathan, who we believe might have been a William from Northern Ireland, who died in the 1960s. But the 3 men that went to Clancy's seemed to be out of their estate, out of Cruises Hotel. Now, what is not realised is that Cruises Hotel had been taken over as a centre for the auxiliaries. There was a detachment of auxiliaries resident in Limerick, even though if you go to the history of the War of Independence, they don't associate the auxiliaries with being barracks in Limerick, but they were based in Cruises Hotel. And the 5 men, it would be believed, were on their way back to Cruises Hotel. And that's why Ibbotson was so reticent about taking out his patrol. That's it.
That's fantastic, Tom. Thanks very much for that. And again, we might come back to it there in a while. Maybe so many questions after your synopsis there as to maybe we might look at the maybe the Crown line going forward there over the next half an hour or so. Just a brief question. Colin McMahon has a question there. I know that at the time it was known as North Strand. As you go over Clancy or you go over the Sarsfield Bridge, I think to the left now is
O'Callaghan Strand.
And so like Michael O'Callaghan was living in St. Margaret's. Is that house still there, Tom?
I'm not sure about that. Yeah. I know that Clancy's house is definitely still there.
Yes.
As is the house where Joseph O'Donoghue was staying.
Joseph O'Donoghue, yeah.
A family called O'Neill's, I think, living in Joseph O'Donoghue, where Joseph O'Donoghue was. But between Jamesborough Church and the Spotted Dog on the left-hand side, there's 2 red brick buildings. They're 2 semi-detached, 2-story, two fine houses. Yeah. And I think it was in the first one of those that ladies were living.
That's great, Tom. Thanks very much. So we move on to Sharon. Sharon Slater is an Irish historian and author. She's the owner of Limerick's Life, born from Sharon's passion for Limerick and its history. I'd encourage anyone with an interest in local history to look it up. It's a fantastic website, and even the Twitter feed is fantastic as well. Obviously, her work primarily focuses on the history of Limerick and Limerick City. She was awarded the National Heritage Hero Award for 2017 from the Heritage Council of Ireland. So we're delighted to have Sharon here tonight, and Sharon is going to go through the 2 widows, I suppose, in the aftermath of the murdered mayors. 2 really fantastic women, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about them. So thanks for joining us, Sharon.
Well, thank you, Mark. So as Tom was mentioning, the 2 widows on that night, they were the sole witnesses to the murders. The widows were Kate O'Callaghan and Mary Clancy. And when they wrote about the tragic night, they wrote very little about themselves. But one poignant note that Kate mentioned later, I'm going to quote this. She said, "Women do not cry much in Ireland during this war. The trouble goes too deep." And I think that's very shows us the strong, just get on with it attitude that these women had at the time. And as Garrod had mentioned, what was going on in the city at the time and how they just had to get on with it. The 2 women, Mary Clancy, she was known to her family as Molly, and Kate O'Callaghan, they were forces to be reckoned with. They were active with their political beliefs before and after the murders. Both women, they had a lot of similarities as well as stark differences in their upbringing. Mary Clancy, she was the older of the two women, but by only 4 years. She was born Mary Ann Killeen on the 7th of July, 1881, out in Ballingarry, County Limerick. Her parents, Mary O'Doherty, was a native Irish speaker from Galway, and her father, Timothy Killeen, he was originally from Offaly and a member of the RIC, which is interesting. Meanwhile, Kate was born Kate Murphy in Crossmahon, County Cork in 1885, and her parents were both County Cork natives, Julia Kelleher and Cornelius Murphy, who was a farmer. And as Tom mentioned, it was a very strong nationalist family, that the Murphys in County Cork. Kate was one of 14 children, so there was plenty of them to hold up the nationalist front, while Mary is one of only 3. At the time of their births, their fathers were on the opposite sides of the political spectrum. Cornelius Murphy was a Fenian activist, while Timothy Keelan was a sub-constable in the RIC. Although it looks like Keelan's political affiliation softened after he retired, because on the 1911 census, although he includes his section as the head of the household in English, and all his details were in English, his wife and daughter's portion of the form were in Irish. So it's a really interesting situation within the household. So Mary was born out in the county, but she had moved into the city with her family by 1901. They were living on Clare Street. She was there with her parents and her older sister. While Kate didn't arrive into Limerick until 1909. These women that we really associate with Limerick City, when neither of them were natives to the city. Both women were fluent in Irish, and that was a skill they used throughout their lives. And Kate was also fluent in French. They were very well educated for their time. And they both became educators, as Tom had mentioned. Kate attended the Royal University in Dublin and Cambridge University. Mary was working as a national school teacher, and by 1916, she was the principal of St. Patrick's Girls' School on the Dublin Road. While Kate, when she moved into the city in 1909, that was to replace her sister, Maria O'Donovan, in her teaching post in Mary Immaculate College. Both of the women really bucked the norms in a lot of ways. One of those was that they didn't get married as soon as they could after it became legal. Instead, Kate waited until she was 28 and Mary was 34. So that was a huge deal not to get married in your early 20s as a woman at the time. It's interesting, though, that although both of the women were working as teachers when they got married, the occupation section of their marriage certificate was left blank. So it wasn't recognized that they actually had these jobs or were educated. Kate gave up her teaching post following her marriage to Michael O'Callaghan in 1914, while Mary continued teaching after she married George Clancy in 1915. It, again, interestingly, playing on the Irish influence and the background they had, Mary and her husband both signed their names in Irish on their marriage certificate. This, it was very unusual, but not totally surprising considering that they met in the Irish Language College in Cork and again in the Limerick Gaelic League. Both of the women were members of Commemorative. In 1921, after the murders, Kate was unanimously elected as the president of the Limerick branch of Commemorative. And that was the only year that Madge Daly, the sister of Ned Daly and sister-in-law of Thomas Clark, who were killed in Easter 1916, didn't hold the role of president. There's the famous photograph by Franz Hasselbach from 1950, and that shows members of the Limerick City Volunteers and Cumann na mBan with both Mary Clancy and her husband George pictured in that. Kate as well, you know, they're extremely strong political women. Kate was involved in the suffrage movement and good friends with Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, and Mary also knew the Sheehy Skeffingtons as well, but she wasn't as strongly involved with the suffrage movement as Kate was. As Tom had mentioned, in the months leading up to the murders, the mayor and former mayor's houses were raided so often that it just became the norm for them. You know, there had been a small lull for a few weeks before, but it wasn't uncommon for them to be raided. But the night of the attack, it was a little bit different for Mary because she was already in a state of grief. Her only sister had passed away a few months earlier, and her elderly parents had moved in with her into Castleview Gardens, where her father had died only 3 days earlier and was buried the day before. So as it was an emotional night, and Tom told the story of what happened that night, and Mary had kept the scar of that memory, but she also kept a scar from where she had been shot on her hand as a constant reminder. And Tom mentioned that neither of the women took part in the military inquest following the murders because, rightly so, they didn't trust that it was going to be fair. Kate would later publish her version of that tragic night, which we found out later was what actually happened, in a pamphlet called the Limerick Curfew Murders. Immediately following the murders, Kate's sister, Maria Donovan, the woman that she came to replace in Mary Immaculate College, was co-opted into the Limerick Council. She was only the second female member of the council, and a few months later, she became the first acting mayor of Limerick when Stephen O'Mara, the mayor, was over in America raising funds for the Republican Loan Fund. So after the tragedy of that night, Kate stayed in her home on O'Callaghan Stand, and she stayed there for the rest of her life. While Mary in 1930 built a new home for herself on the North Circular Road called Dungur, and that was named after her husband's favourite spot, Loch Gur. Her mother lived with her for 10 years, while Mary lived there for the rest of her life. Following the tragedy as well, both women continued in politics in their own ways. While Mary was a staunch member of the Fianna Fáil party and was often on the platform with Eamon de Valera at his official visits to Limerick, she often spoke out in support of local Fianna Fáil politicians during elections, but she never put herself forward for election. On the other side, Kate put herself straight into the front line straight away. Her political stance was so noted that the British intelligence offices kept a file on her, and in that they called her a clever and dangerous woman. And I think that was a good sign, and to be called that meant she was doing something good. She became one of the Black Widows who were elected to the Dáil in May 1921. And another one of the Black Widows elected that year was Limerick woman Kathleen Clark. Kate kept her seat in the Dáil that year, and she also joined De Valera's illegal second Dáil. In April 1923, she was on her way to a funeral in Tipperary when she was arrested and taken to Kilmainham jail. She went on hunger strike there and was released 19 days later. She lost her Dáil seat in 1923 and then left politics, but went back to Mary Immaculate College for a few years, teaching the teachers. She didn't always agree with De Valera and his politics, and in 1937 she wrote to him criticising what he had put down as the role of women in the new constitution. So it harks back to her role in the suffragette movement. The women were also very involved in erecting monuments to the victims of the War of Independence. And they were involved in the renaming, in the campaign to rename the streets, which happened in 1934. And in 1955, Kate presented Mayor Ted Russell with a new link for the chain, which in the memory of her husband. And the following year, Mary did the same thing. And both women were very involved members in the Strand House Memorial Committee, who in 1958 proposed the memorial to the victims, but the memorial wasn't erected for another 10 years, and neither of the women got to see it. In later life, Kate was very involved with Féile Limni and was the chair of the Féile Limni drama section for 15 years. Mary and Kate outlived their husbands by 40 years. You have to imagine the amount of time that separated, but they kept on and kept their memory alive that entire time. The women died a year apart from each other, Kate in March 1961 and Mary in June 1962. Both women were given a guard of honour by the old IRA before they were buried in the Republican plot in Mount St. Lawrence next to their husbands. They were honoured with a gun salute, and the last post was sounded at the funerals. And although neither of the women had children of their own, and the direct link to that night was severed with them, their legacy didn't die with them, as they had their hands in every memorial. So there's a piece of them in the city. And they also continue to influence generations to come. And when I was talking to Garode recently, he mentioned that Mary would come and visit the local school and give the hurling team a few words of encouragement in Irish. And even this event tonight continues their legacy. And I'd like to thank the Limerick GAA for hosting it.
Thanks very much, Sharon. That's fantastic. Really kind of brings back to life, I suppose, the role that they had, and I suppose that their spirit kind of shines through, because obviously it was an extremely difficult period for them. But the remarkable courage and strength and resilience they showed is really it's a tribute to them, really, and we're all very proud of them here in Limerick. I suppose just before we go on to maybe a few questions, I suppose it was a very successful period in Limerick GAA history. We were fortunate enough to win the All-Ireland in 1918, and also fortunate enough to win it in 1921, even though the final was played in 1923. But I know Garode referenced Jim Dalton. Like, Jim Dalton was a real Limerick sporting hero, I suppose, played on the commercials team that won the first All-Ireland football title with Limerick, and trained the team in 1918 as well. So I know Carberry in the 1950s and 60s wrote and penned a lot of fantastic articles in relation to GAA, and he wrote it, but he actually made contact with Dan Troy from the Tlahan Club, who was on the 1918 Limerick team. And Dan Troy just gives an idea of the preparations that the team and the physical preparations they were put through in preparation for the All-Ireland final. And I'll just read out directions from Jim Dalton that were given to him. It is desirable to prepare for the fray with a light dose of Epsom salts before breakfast. Some of this stuff now for the younger generation watching it might be a little bit removed from the present day strength and conditioning methods, but I still think it's an absolutely fascinating piece of information. As the ground is likely to be heavy, constant practice of the muscles is necessary so that the men will retain their hitting power to the end of the match. Obviously, a lot of the hurling at that stage was on the ground, and again, it was a striking game rather than the possession game we have today. For this purpose, practice with the hurley is essential, and hurley rather than hurl. I'll emphasize that. Do not stop too long at exercise at any time, or you would become mechanical and slow, thereby losing whip and spirited, swift movement. Do not mind the weather conditions, because a cold can always be avoided by dressing in togs for exercise and rubbing over with towel and changing clothes immediately, putting your togs, if necessary, to dry for the next day. There is no healthier time to exercise than a wild blustering day. Begin your work by hard walks every night and an odd short jog. Do not start sprinting until you feel that your system and sinews are toned up to work. When sprinting, start with a few loose runs at natural speed so as to get the blood flowing naturally through the nervous system, and also to speed up the heart by degrees. By this system, you strengthen the valvular system of the heart and do permanent good to yourself. Do not overdo exercise. It weakens the heart, and such exercise does harm instead of good. Watch your weight, and if you're carrying too much, do not allow yourself to reduce quickly. He further goes on in assessing the Wexford team, calling them strong. The Limerick objective of being strong and swift would be attained, he tells the players, by going to bed early and being up by 7:30 a.m. In order to attain the prescribed 9 hours sleep, they were to be asleep by 10:30 p.m. In obtaining this amount of rest, the sleep will rest the heart and distribute the juices of the body. Smoking was injurious, and he describes alcohol or fermented drinks simply as poison. Fluid, he told his charges, including water, should be limited, as it keeps the liver extended to the flesh full of moisture and in turn affects what is known as the wind. He tells his players that it is well once or twice before breakfast while training to take as much glauber salts as you would pile on a shilling. So,
Mark, for the first time ever, his half-back line got fit. That was the key to his success.
Very good, Tom. Very
Bill
good.
Hoff, Jack Keane, and Denny Lanigan.
Lanigan.
For the first and only time in their hurling careers, they were fully fit.
Yeah, and I think actually just in researching it, I think they went to fines for a number of weeks before the All-Ireland final for a training camp, and of course that's a very famous Limerick half-back line, which was known at the time as the Hindenburg line, because nothing could get past it. So a really fantastic time in our GAA history, and we're very proud of those two teams. And of course, I know our Rooney, Michael O'Riordan will be unveiling a commemorative jersey to commemorate that great team in 1921. So we'll all look forward to that.
He was not Ireland boxing champion himself.
Yeah, that's right.
Dalton. He had trained hard, and the regime for the boxing was something he translated into all athletic and physical things.
Yes.
Yeah. I think he played a bit of handball as well, Gerard.
He did. That's correct. He did, Mark. He did indeed.
Yeah.
Mind you, I'm not altogether sure, according to the reputation he had in later years. I think he was only in his late 40s when he was killed. He wasn't an older man, but I'm not altogether sure he practiced what he preached in relation to alcohol. In the later stages of his life, there were rumours that he was partial to a little drop. Let me put it that way.
So he was on his way home from the pub, wasn't he, when he was shot?
He was, correct. He was, Bennett Street. He was.
Pub in the middle of the day.
A taste on every now and then.
Yeah.
I suppose, Gerard, even just to expand on that a little bit, in terms of GA, I know, like I just mentioned it there maybe earlier on, that there were numerous, I suppose, a few political events that spilled over into the GA. I know there was the Parnell split, and then you had maybe the IRB were trying to get into the GA clubs to try and recruit members. And I suppose a lot of this maybe had an effect on Limerick GA. I mean, is there any kind of is there anything more you could tell us on that? I know that, like, when you had the 1916 rising and the assassination, or the leaders were assassinated after that. Yeah. I know that wave of sympathy brought this kind of cultural revolution, and the Conor Gaeilge and Jay became a lot more popular. But maybe before that,
the issue of the GAA's connection with politics, and more particularly with the independence movement, as it were. Yeah. GAA was from its very beginnings deeply national, in the sense that it, by definition, it was to encourage, support, and to preserve what was believed to be the indigenous games as against from imports. There was also the democratic impulse that effectively GAA was to allow ordinary people to organise their own sports rather than to have the officers and the players, as it were, which was part of some of the older organisations in the late 19th century. But nevertheless, I think it is important to remember that even though there's numerous, thousands of close connections between GAA activists and those who were active in the politics of it, certainly from right through from the 1890s onwards, through the Gaelic League and so on. The GAA as an organisation attempted to stay clear of being too closely associated with any political movement, or more particularly any political faction. And even in 1916 itself, of course, Luke O'Toole as General Secretary of the organisation, the President Association from Nolan, as of Nolan Park in Kilkenny, who was an IRB man himself, and they were absolutely scrupulous that the GAA, though they were strongly nationalist and many of themselves were involved, they didn't want, nor were they weren't prescribed as an organisation, for example, in the same way as the Gaelic League and Sinn Féin and on. They were seen as a sporting body which were strongly nationalist in their affiliations. Symbolism was important. It was noticed regularly from the time of the funeral of Parnell onwards that the more advanced nationalists, as they were called, invariably carried hurleys on ceremonial occasions. Hurleys on the shoulders were part of the salute to Parnell's funeral, for example, and it was noted. In other words, the symbolism of the GAA was seen as an announcement, or as a proclamation of advanced nationalist views. Now, that needn't necessarily have been the case for those who were playing the games. They may have been playing it for sport, or for local loyalty, or because they were rounded up in the parish, or because they were a Jersey short, or for any number of reasons. But the general thing was that carrying hurleys made some kind of statement that you were sympathetic to advanced nationalism if you weren't in an organisation. Now, it's only when splits began to occur for particular reasons within that nationalist, if you like, monolith. The one you mentioned already. But the IRB saw the GAA as a useful way of infiltrating, and there was a brief time for it to try and take it over, but it was resisted. And similarly, right through after 1916, the GAA moved absolutely deliberately towards direct support of the Advanced Nationalist Party. Not because they announced it from Croke Park, but because playing games, for example, as benefit games for prisoners, playing games as benefit games for the victims, generally speaking, being seen to do things that other sporting bodies weren't doing. The games were still the central preoccupation. The games were what the organisation was for at every level, local and central. But the affiliation to the nationalist cause became more and more pointed, as it were, with the passage of time. Again, in the War of Independence, factions mattered, because even before the split on the treaty, there were different loyalties between different battalions and brigades and so on, personality rivalries. One of the things you'll probably notice from your own work in Limerick, for example, is fellas change clubs fairly regularly. Very much so. And it wasn't just because the other club had a better chance of winning, though that often happened. Young Ireland used to pick up fellas from all over the clubs in Limerick, because I know what kind of recruiting they were doing, or who was noting it. But fellas did change clubs a lot. Some of this was because of contacts, work routine, a lot of different things. And remember, you're not talking about a central stadium or an organisation that has the Markets Field, Hartigan's Cross. You start plotting on the map the different fields in which games were played. And you can see, particularly during the War of Independence, for example, who was a danger in travelling, who was going to be going across the town, or indeed in the case of the country areas, particularly, who were likely to run across a patrol if they were going to a game, over from Croom to Adair, as it were. And remember, as you know, Marcus, the City Board was only established in 1902. I think it was the same year as the West Board, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. The West Board, I think, was established of the GAA in Limerick I think it was 1902, because in my recollection, you just got in Adair in time for the centenary. You were 2001, wasn't it?
That's right.
Just before the centenary of the West Board, I think Adair lifted the county championship for the first time. Yeah. But the different boards began to try and mediate local rivalries as well. But obviously, and without making too big a story of it, obviously the Civil War was a huge seismic bang. Mm-hmm. Civil War everywhere. Absolutely shattered the Gaelic League, the whole, if you like, all those which were a broad church of nationalist opinion, whether it was cultural, sporting, or anything else. The Civil War was a poisonous split right down. It took a very long time. it's probably not as long for the GAA as for some other movements to heal it. Putting on the jersey for the county was probably one of the most important early signs of, I won't say reconciliation, but of putting it behind us and getting on with it. And it was because the GAA had kept the games and the promotion of the games front and centre throughout all of the convulsions of the previous 40 years.
Joe Barrett from Kerry, he wrote a very good book, say, In the Name of the Game. Now, there's one, the book was Joe Barrett. He was Joe Barrett's son. And he brought out the point that it was the GAA that healed the splits in Kerry, with the result that his father, Joe Barrett, who was jailed during the Civil War, actually nominated Con Brosnan to be captain. Now, Brosnan was a captain in the Free State Army, and he nominated Brosnan to be captain of the Kerry team. His own club didn't forgive him for it, but it was a measure of the man himself.
But just a little footnote to that, Mark. Of course, there was, for long afterwards, it rankled in memory, even long afterwards. For example, the rivalries between Claghon and St. Patrick's, there were a whole series of things that had echoes, even though they didn't obviously carry on as better. But I remember very well, I remember in the heyday of Tipperary hurling and a team of the late 50s, early 60s. I remember in the old athletic grounds in Cork, as Tipperary took the field. And there were 3 or 4 fellas from Limerick behind me, and Limerick were playing Tipperary. And Tony Wall led out Tipperary at centre back. And this fella behind me, I was only, learning the trade there. This fella behind me says, I don't mind that fella, he's only a Free State captain. This is in the late 1950s. Yeah. So the old memories lasted even when, they didn't mean anything as bitter, but they were still a notation of loyalties.
Yeah. I think actually the Western Limerick Board, and of course it's my own division when it was set up in 1902, William Hawke's father was chairman, the first chairman, I think. So right. I mean, there's another link to the 1921 team, and I think William was captain of Limerick in 1918. But I suppose, a lot of credit for that success probably would have had to go to Newcastle West, because at that time, when Limerick won their first All-Ireland, Kilfinnan represented Limerick, and it was the club that represented Limerick, even though it's not the same as the club today. It wasn't parish based. You had people from surrounding clubs playing with them, like from junior clubs and that. But Newcastle West, anyway, they relinquished the right to have their sole Limerick being represented by themselves, and that allowed the likes of Bob McConkey, who was a fantastic forward at the time, probably one of the best in the country, to play with the county team, and it got him over the line in 1918, and they were able to continue on to 19.
They had 10 clubs.
The late Sean Murphy's book on the West Board is a fine chronicle of things.
Yeah. They had 10 clubs on that team, Mark. That was unheard of.
Unheard of,
in 1918. Now, it was largely due, let's be straight, it was largely due to Bill Hawke.
Yes.
Because he was the only one from Newcastle West on the team. Now, Newcastle West, instead of taking the selection, they nominated 5 selectors. Only Bill Hawke was from Newcastle West.
Oh, yeah. That's fantastic. And like, it's the landmark kind of decision at the time, And I suppose, again, just going back to the early days, I suppose, especially in the city, like, you just go back to the kind of landscape, like you had Claghon and Young Ireland's based in the same place. Their club rooms were the Gaelic League Hall in Thomas Street. Mm-hmm. And they had a fantastic rivalry all through the 20s and 30s, and I suppose a hand took over in the 30s, and they had a huge amount of success after that. But then in the 50s as well, probably Garrod, there'd be Treaty and St. Patrick's as well. They had a fantastic rivalry as well.
And they were a double code team. Treaty had county championships in hurling and football. in the 1950s, a few of them. And at that stage, the football stronghold, I mean, the city, Clahan and Treaty were, as football clubs in the city, retained both codes.
Yeah.
But the big ones were Father Casey's and Abbeyfield and the Western Gales and these. And the smaller clubs that had fed into the hurling grid, like Monaghan and these, were getting absorbed at the time. But yes, the 1950s, of course, a huge clearance through emigration. Emigration was devastated in the 1950s. I mean, when you actually look at that Ireland as a whole lost 410,000 in the decade alone, and the rural areas, it's quite remarkable. You certainly, the city clubs, the rivalries retained, and Treaty lasted for a long time, as indeed did Clahan. And the way the Christian Brothers, I might say just a word on that, because we were talking about it to Sharon, and the portraits of the beautiful portraits she has given of the two women really was splendid. They were two very, very remarkable women, and she has done them justice. But the Christian Brothers, you see, had a network. For example, they played outside the city as well. I think it was the O'Mara Cup, was the hurling cup. The O'Mara Cup had Adair and Doon as the teams outside the city, who played those who won the city in the seniors. So that you'd have the Christian Brothers, and St. Patrick's, out Patrick's Road, and Patrick's Well would be there. But Doon and Adair were two of the Christian Brothers schools that were part of that mix, so that you got, and if I'm not greatly mistaken, they were given an extra year because of the fact that they had a smaller catchment area. They could play fellas a year older, which we always used to give out. But they were, and the network that the Brothers of schools had was very important in keeping games going at underage outside of your own area for many, many years, for as long as the Brothers had an assembly line, as it were, of hurling trainers coming through the schools.
Fantastic. That's great stuff, Carol. I suppose just back to the mayors, like again, in researching this, I suppose it nearly brings you back to apartheid South Africa, these military courts of inquiry, and a lot of the commentary, shot in the back while trying to escape, etc., etc. So I suppose, Tom, can you just go through what the Crown line was? I know that the
Crown line was very peculiar. They said that the two mayors, or the mayor and the ex-mayor, were shot by extreme Republicans because they were holding a line against more extreme actions in the city. In other words, they were keeping the extreme Republicans at bay. Isn't that ironic? And they raided their houses on numerous occasions. And when the situation arose, they just shot them. And yet they came out and claimed that the two mayors were shot because they were at variance with extreme Republicans.
Another question in there, Sharon. Were the Black Widows nationalists first and feminists second, or vice versa?
That's a very good question.
A
loaded one.
Yeah, really is. And actually, there was the six Black Widows. It would be a case of maybe it was a different for each one of them, but it was definitely a line that was together. The feminism, and it came out of the 1916 proclamation. It was very women forward and equality for everybody. So they were coming on the back of that. So there was definitely a feminist side to the nationalism for these women. And at the stage that they were, you have to remember at the times the suffrage movement was really had its legs going in England and in Ireland. So they were seeing that and they were involved in that. So it's a good question, and I don't have an answer for it.
You've ducked it.
And there's just another one there from Gabriel Doherty. So a question for Sharon or any of the rest of the lads, if you want to go for it. But Kathleen O'Callaghan, in her speech in the Dáil on the 20th of December 1920, opposing the treaty, described the agreement as a crime, quote, for it leaves England's hands free to deal with places like Egypt and India, and in the name, I suppose, of our common citizenship, end quote.
Mhm.
And the question is, how extensive was this type of anti-imperial sentiment in Limerick Republican circles at the time?
I think Garode probably answered that a minute ago when he was saying about you could see the split, the sudden split. You know, everybody was together coming up to during the War of Independence, but then there was that sudden split in the Civil War. So I'll hand it back to Garode. I think that he answered that question, how the split was.
This is Gabriel in UCC, I suppose. I think the sentiment that Coit Callahan had about what exactly this meant in empire, so insofar as we can track it, there was one strand of the Republican movement was aware and was acutely aware that what was happening had significance. After all, Amritsar had happened. There had been Egypt and India were already showing the early signs that they weren't forward nationalist leaders there, that they were not effectively satisfied to be loyal to the empire. So that the Irish situation and its reverberations, just as the same way in Limerick itself, for example, a few short years before in 1919, during the big strike that's known as the Limerick Soviet of 1919, about 14,000 took over the city for a short time. There was one strain of that was strongly aware that the socialist revolution, as it were, was happening elsewhere as well. So there's an awareness that what is going on, that the events that they were living through were part of a wider, if you like, tremor that was going on elsewhere. How extensive it was, it's difficult to know. I suspect that you won't find it in the columns of the newspapers, except for foreign intelligence, as it were. But certainly, Coit Callahan, and in this, I would follow Sharon's line on. I do think Coit Callahan probably was more. How should one put this? More immediately tuned in to the implications of what she was about. Maybe had to do with her background and education. I'm not saying that she was more intellectual than Moira Killeen in any kind of fundamental sense, but I think she was probably more. She had an eye to different screens around her, more actively, and the fact that she went immediately into politics herself, and that she continued, and she took a very active role during the Civil War split and so on. Does indicate that she was working her way through political and intellectual positions, perhaps at a more accelerated rate than Moira Killeen. That's not, making it a comparison that says one was more or less the other. But I think there were distinctions between them in terms of their alertness to what was going on elsewhere. That would be my feeling.
That's great.
I think with the
Sorry.
I was just going to say about the women themselves and that political movement that Kate Callahan took straight into politics. And I think Mary Clancy was probably held back by all the grief that she had endured in the time, in the lead up, because her only sister had passed away only a few months earlier, and then she was dealing with her parents in her house. Her brother died only a few days earlier, and then she had to take care of her mother, where Kate was more free. She had her education. She didn't have children. She didn't have people to mind. She could go forward, where Mary still had her mother, who was quite elderly, that she had to take care of, and she was still going through that grief.
That's great. I suppose there's another question here. Could any one of the speakers comment on the friendship of Clancy with James Joyce? I know Clancy, he actually taught Michael O'Callaghan Irish, I think. Michael O'Callaghan was highly educated. I think he qualified as an industrial chemist before taking over as managing director of the tannery business. But can any of you just comment on the friendship between Clancy and James Joyce? Maybe, I suppose, in college at Dublin, I suppose. They
were at college together, and I think Clancy is referred to in some of Joyce's novels. I can't think of the name he used. He used a kind of a cover name for Clancy, but certainly they were, they were good friends. both taught in Clongowes together.
Very good. And I suppose this is probably a question that won't be answered, Tom. But you know, how far up the line did it go? Like you had Tomás McCurtain. I think Michael O'Callaghan got his first warning that he was going to be killed after being seen at that funeral, and he got subsequent warnings after that. But you know, we just went through the Crown line. Yeah.
George Montague Nathan was the man that organised the murder. Now, in my view, he was responsible for 6 killings in Limerick.
Right.
In November 1920, you had the shooting of Blake and O'Neill at the cross of Grange out on the Tipperary Road. There was Tom Blake shot.
January 20th of January.
Yeah, he was working as a chemist in Laird's, and someone in Laird's spilled the beans on him. He was siphoning off chemicals. Now, that was 3 of them. You had as I say, the 2 mayors, right? Now, in addition, there was, who else was it? There was at least one other shootings that had all the hallmarks of Nathan, and I reckon that the guy that was with him, now George Bennett or Richard Bennett, did a lot of research into them. Now Bennett wrote the book The Black and Tans, and when he went at the thing first, he was very, dare I say it, very anti-Irish. But as he delved into the research, he realised, hold on, what you're seeing here is not what's really happening, and he became much more pro-Irish by the time he was finished.
But the other thing, Mark, though, is remember that in addition or parallel with the actual military campaign, the Dáil Éireann was constructing an alternative state, a counter-state. And one of the key parts of that was local government. And from the late summer of 1920, Dáil Éireann effectively instructed the local authorities, which had voted strongly, of course, for Sinn Féin in the July elections for the county council, to withdraw recognition and all contact with the local government board. And between the arbitration Sinn Féin courts and an embryonic Department of Local Government that was looking after certain things, even though it was strapped for cash. And Limerick did well in that, by the way. It is said that Limerick County Council, as it withdrew its recognition of the local government board in Dublin, had the good fortune to have an accommodating bank manager in Limerick, which was not all that common in other counties, who gave them the overdraft to enable essential works on roads and that to be undertaken. So it wasn't, the mayor's, McCurtain was very early, this was the year before, but there were plenty of councillors in different counties. Urban district councillors and county councillors, and indeed Sean Wall, Tom Toomey referred to him earlier this evening. Wall was, and there were at least, I think there were at least 3 or 4 elected other elected figures in Limerick over the total period. So elected political figures had an important role as a counter state is being established. And remember, the Limerick was put under martial law in December of 1920. That gave huge powers and instilled great fear because of the range of offences and so on that gave discretion. But even without that, I suppose the distinction one can make, and I think Tom would be familiar with this, is the distinction between acting with impunity and acting under authority. Acting with impunity meant that you could do things without fear of having to pay the penalty. And that went back, my own view is that went back well into the early days of the War of Independence. But certainly from late 1920, once the full complement of Tans and Dogsies were in, and once Lloyd George and the others realized that this was going to be really tough, then the active authority for reprisals, for example, for burnings, and burnings are a key thing in this. There's a historian in Exeter in England called Gemma Clark, and she's been working on the importance of fire and reprisals in colonial wars generally, this business of showing terror to the civilian community by burning key assets and so on in teaching a lesson. Public figures, prominent public figures who have status, who give, if you like, leadership, they were seen as key figures that were part of the counter state. So even if, I mean, Michael Callaghan wasn't an active volunteer or anything, but nevertheless, they were important symbolic figures of the state that was challenging authority, and therefore they were part of the enemy and had to be dealt with ruthlessly as well.
Very good. And just going back to 1920, when Michael O'Callaghan was mayor, like how were relations, I suppose, when he was mayor, or you know, why would Michael O'Callaghan and George Clancy be seen as threats, or why were they targeted? You know, why wasn't it someone who was connected more militarily with the conflict at the time?
Well, they represented nationalist Ireland.
Yeah.
Now, you see, British intelligence were trying to drive a split. Like, it comes back to the shooting of James Dalton. You know, create a split. You know, and you can justify anything. Now, as I say, certainly O'Callaghan and Clancy, you know, they weren't the most militant IRA drivers, but that's neither here nor there. The British were trying to drive a split between the various factions of Sinn Féin by shooting them.
Yeah. And I suppose, just another question to add to that then, like, in the overall kind of maybe dirty propaganda war, like, was it a massive own goal for Crown forces and the British establishment?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Because everyone knew who did it.
Yeah.
I mean, you can only get benefit if you can create doubt. The very fact that the two widows would not turn up for the military inquiry, should that taught you what they believed?
Yeah.
And the fact that it happened during a curfew as well. You know, there wouldn't have been rogue Sinn Féin people wandering around the streets during a curfew, because even when the phone calls were being made out of O'Callaghan's house to get people to come to tend to Michael O'Callaghan as he lay dying, the people answering the phones were all very afraid to leave their houses because it was a curfew and everybody was risk of being shot. So when they heard this rumor that it wasn't that it was a Sinn Féin plot, everybody locally was like, that's a load of rubbish.
I mean, the fact that our friend, the District Inspector Ibbotson, took 25 minutes to take a patrol out of the barracks. What was that about? Yeah. I mean, how did the sentry below at the Strand Barracks?
Yeah.
He had been walking past him. He didn't challenge them. A couple of minutes later, he hears shots fired, and they run back past him. And lo and behold, he doesn't challenge them the second time either.
And he fought afterwards in the Spanish Civil War, Tom, did he, Nathan, and admitted it in a kind of an informal...
Yeah, he joined the Communist Party, actually.
Right.
Montague, or Nathan. He became a communist, like, and as I say, he was killed at the Battle of Bruneta. And when he was dying, he called all the fellas in to sing him out of this world. I think they sang the Internationale as he was dying.
My God.
He was tough.
But Mark, the question about why did they pick on them? But remember, they were the first two mayors that were elected under the new local authorities that were refusing to recognise.
Yeah.
In other words, that was the start of the thing. And it's quite interesting, even though in Limerick Corporation, for example, about, I think, nearly, certainly 40% or so of the outgoing councillors got back, or people who had been in the corporation before got back in January of 1920. But they were now totally in a different orientation, and therefore they were fair game. It must also be remembered, I suppose, that by the end of 1920, the efforts that had been made to try and get peace talks going had broken down.
Yeah.
A man from a neighbouring county, of course, Archbishop Clune of Perth in Australia, in December of 1920, a man from the parish of Rouen, Jimmy Smith country. He had done a good effort when he was to try and get some talks going, but it broke down because the British insisted that the IRA would surrender their arms or lay down their arms. Nothing came of it. But there were peace talks in the air. And then this starts off. And Limerick, I mean, after all, February, one of the biggest losses the RIC suffered. Was it 11 or 12 RIC were lost at Drumkeen, Tom? I think it was 11 or 12. 11. And that was a huge loss, huge loss in the spring of 1921. When you consider, for example, that, you know, the IRA losses in early 21 were becoming serious. You know, you talk about the Cork thing was gone badly wrong with Clonmult and Upton. And Upton, and there would be other ones, Mourneabbey, and the Drumkeen episode was a serious military operation, and effectively there was bound to be a blowback from it. And here you had two very prominent public representatives, very prominent, the mayor and the former mayor, of now a strongly nationalist and assertive local authority, and essentially. It was a matter of unleashing terror to show that would not be put up with.
Listen, lads, that's fantastic. I'd love to stay and chat here all night. That's really informative, and you know, it's been a real, it's nearly 2 hours now. It's gone like 5 minutes, so it's been really enjoyable. I'm teaching young lads in history there, and they all know about Kilmichael, and they all know about Terence McSweeney and Tomas McCurtain. So. It's not about bragging rights or anything like this, but I just think it's very important, like to pay tribute to Michael O'Callaghan, to George Clancy and James O'Donoghue, and even just mentioning Drumkeen there as well. You know, Limerick was I suppose it was a war zone, like a lot of the other Munster counties at the time, and we're just very proud, I suppose, not only of the success that our hurling team had in 1921 and with being receiving the Lee McCarthy Cup for the very first time, but we're very proud, I suppose, just before they were killed, the contributions of Mayor O'Callaghan and Mayor Clancy as well to the civic society in Limerick City, and we'd just like to mark that occasion tonight. On behalf of myself and the panellists, I'd like to thank the Limerick City and County Council, the County Board as well, I suppose, especially Paul Foley, who's done Trojan work on this project, John Cregan as well as Cahirlock. I'd just like to hand you over now to Rooney, our Secretary of Cuiste Cummanúcla Square Limni, Michael O'Riordan, to unveil the jersey, the centenary edition of the 1921 All-Ireland champions who were presented with the Lee McCarthy Cup for the first time. I hope you all at home got something out of this. It's been a really enjoyable experience from my point of view anyway, and I'd just like to wish you a very pleasant evening, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Good evening, everybody, and quite an informative night it has been so far with our MC Mark and his auditors, who have been absolutely outstanding. From Limerick GA's perspective, we just want to acknowledge their contribution, and it has been immense. In the meantime, in relation to the All-Ireland final in 1921, as Paul and the speakers have said previously, the game was not played until 1923. Indeed, there was no Munster Championship game played in 1921. It was played in 22. There was only one game played, Limerick and Cork, and that was played in Thurles. Limerick winning on that occasion and going to the All-Ireland semi-final. That game in question was played in the Markets Field. Limerick won that game, and they followed through to the All-Ireland final on the 4th of March in 1923. The captain of the day was Bob McConkey, and again, like many of the players in that team, their relatives are still in Limerick, and we were delighted during the week that his family made contact with us
both sides of his family, and obviously the medals are still in Limerick that he won over his illustrious career. As Grode said that earlier, a lot of players move from club to club. Bob's initial club was St Patrick's, and he moved to Young Ireland's, where he won 5 senior hurling championships. He captained Limerick in 1921. Obviously the final was played in 23. There's a lot of connections in relation to Limerick from that game. The Lee McCarthy Cup, obviously Lee McCarthy, his mother was from Bruff, Bridget Deneen, and it is said that he got his Gaelic pastimes through her influence. Again, we have players in question. We had Mick Neville from the famed Neville family from Kilfinny. He played with Dublin in that final. He came back to Limerick afterwards and was successful on a Munster Senior Hurling final. And again, our Centre of Excellence in Rathkeale is named in memory of Mick. You've Garrett Howard, who won 5 senior All-Ireland Championship medals, playing with 3 different counties, and he was wing back on that occasion as well. And fantastic interludes in relation to all those. Deanie Lanigan, another player in question, was heavily involved in the Gaelic rounds and became later a county board official, and the county under-21 hurling cup, which was recently decommissioned, was named in his honour. So again, just from a Limerick perspective, it was decided we would commemorate the team from 1921 with the replica jersey that they wore on the day, which is highlighted in the GA Museum, and obviously in the book by Seamus O'Callaghan and Sean Murphy, the 100 Years of Glory. So again, as I have the jersey here, we have it's a deeper green than the traditional green jersey that Limerick would have in the hooped fashion, and then with the Lee McCarthy Cup embossed on either sleeve. We have changed the crest. Obviously, there was no crest back in 2021, stroke 23. So we put a poetic license, and we inscribed a new gold Limerick crest on the particular jersey. The Lee McCarthy Cup, again, was presented by the president, Dan McCarthy, from Dublin, as Liam was not present on the All-Ireland final day as well. So from Limerick's perspective, the jersey is available on the O'Neill's website, retailing at €70, and it's available now. We have it launched, and thanks very much, and I hope you enjoyed a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, Mike. So it's my job just to close out the evening. The jersey that Mike has just shown you is very, very special in memory of 1921. I have to say the online reaction has been phenomenal for tonight. It's been extraordinary with viewers all over the world. We've had thousands of viewers looking at what went on. And in the context of all of it, before I start thanking people, I'd like to mention actually the John Daly Cup, which is the blue ribboned trophy for club hurling in Limerick. It's presented to the county senior hurling champions each year, and that was presented by Madge Daly a few years after 1921 when these events took place, and the same cup is still being presented to this day. Madge Daly was a niece of John Daly, who was a leading member of the IRB, and hugely people that had a huge formative influence, not just on Limerick but on our state. And it just worthy of mention. I felt tonight, just as we listened to the deliberations. So the online reaction has been incredible. We've had thousands of viewings. It's been a privilege for me to help in organising this, and I'd like to thank my fellow county board officers and indeed the clubs of Limerick for their support in initiating it, in particular our chairman John Cregan and the county board secretary Michael O'Riordan. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our speakers. The calibre of our speakers and how they responded when we approached them to ask them to participate was so heartwarming, and it felt very much of pure Limerick pride and spirit. Mark Foley, Garrod O'Tuig, Tom Toomey, Sharon Slater all agreed to participate without batting an eyelid. Unfortunately, Brian Murphy wasn't able to participate tonight for reasons of technology, so we wish Brian the best. But it was a privilege to listen to our contributors tonight, and I'm certain, and looking at the many comments coming through online, that you did enjoy them. I'd like to pay particular tribute to Raphael Rocca and the team at Sporting Limerick, who produced and directed the technology and the camera work and the structuring of the evening. Heartfelt thank you to Raphael and the team. A special word of thanks to Tony Storn at Limerick City and County Council, who was very receptive and supportive, and the Mayor Michael Collins, who was very supportive also. And it was a great partnership for Limerick GA to work with the council on this, and very appropriate. We got some very solid promotion as well from local media. Liam O'Brien in the Queeniger Limnock page. I'd like to thank Cathy Halloran, who ran a piece on tonight's RTE News, and Don O'Sullivan of the Limerick Leader, and Anne-Marie and Joe from the Today Show on 95 FM. And I'd like to mention Tony Brown, the Limerick Historical Society. I got some encouraging words of advice from Tony there a few weeks ago as we pulled this event together as well. So really, this date, the 7th of March, 100 years ago exactly, was very profound. Joseph O'Donoghue, George Clancy, Michael O'Callaghan all lost their lives in very tragic, historic circumstances. We remember them tonight. We remember the people of 1921, and to everybody that tuned in, Gorv Mila Magwif Galer.